Just as with financial accounting, terminology is very important for managerial accounting. So let's continue with some terminology. In this video, we're going to look at manufacturing costs. Manufacturing costs consist of three items. You have direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Let's go through each of these in more detail. Direct material is raw materials that become a physical part of the finished product. So these are costs that are direct, and these costs can be cost effectively traced to the finished product. For example, if our cost object is a car, direct materials would include the steering wheel, the steel that goes into making the car, tires, speakers, etc. So if there is any material or any component that's in the finished product, that is called a direct material. Keep in mind that direct materials are not the basic materials. It can be components like a steering wheel or a tire that manufacturers buy from other companies. It's the component that companies buy that ends up in the finished product. Next, let's look at direct labor. Direct labor is the cost of employees who make the product. Again, this is a direct cost. This cost can be cost effectively traced to the finished product. So the company can determine exactly who the people are that's making the product, and the salaries and the benefits that these people get paid can be traced to the finished product because the company knows exactly how long these people took to finish the product. For example, for a car, we're looking at the wages and benefits of the assembly line workers who work on the car. Typically, when there are questions on classifying direct material, direct labor, and so on, whenever you see assembly line workers, that is always direct labor. Next, let's look at factory overhead. Factory overhead is often called manufacturing overhead or just simply overhead. So you'll hear me use the term manufacturing overhead or factory overhead. They all mean the same thing. These are costs that are not direct material or direct labor. So any cost that is incurred in the factory that is not direct material or direct labor is classified as manufacturing overhead or factory overhead. These are indirect costs. These cannot be cost effectively traced to the finished product. Since these cannot be traced to the finished product, later we're going to learn different ways on how to figure out how much factory overhead will be assigned to the product, because our goal is we need to figure out how much it costs the company to manufacture a product. Well, factory overhead costs cannot be traced, therefore we have to figure out some method of assigning these costs. Again, that's a topic we'll talk about later. Factory overhead is further categorized into indirect material, indirect labor, and other indirect costs. All these costs are only incurred in the factory or plant. So whenever you are doing a question and they give you questions and say classify this into manufacturing overhead, direct material, direct labor, and so on, if the cost is not incurred in the factory, then it is not a manufacturing cost. It's some other kind of cost. It's still a cost that the company has to spend or incur, but it's not considered a manufacturing cost. So you're going to look for the terms factory or plant. That means it is a manufacturing cost. Let's look at indirect materials next. Now, indirect material is a factory overhead, but we are classifying it further. These are materials that are used in manufacturing that cannot be cost effectively traced to the finished product. For example, cleaning supplies and napkins that are used in the factory. They're still necessary for the product to be manufactured, but they are not in the final product. But if there were no cleaning supplies and napkins, people cannot work at the factory, and therefore these are still costs for the product that we need to figure out how these costs are going to be included in the product. These are physical items, so that's why they are indirect materials. Sometimes materials that we do find in the finished product are classified as indirect materials when their costs are low. For example, if you're looking at a car, the car uses a little bit of glue in certain places, or lubricants. Not a lot, but they use glue and lubricants in manufacturing the car. The cost of these materials used in the product are so low, it doesn't make sense for the company to trace exactly how much glue or lubricants were used for the car. So they just treat the cost of glue and lubricants as indirect materials. Typically, you'll find things like glue, salt, lubricants, screws and nuts and bolts, those kind of things could be classified as indirect materials when they're used in small quantities or their costs are low. Next, let's look at indirect labor. This is labor used in the manufacturing process or at the factory that cannot be cost-effectively traced to the finished product. For example, the supervisor salaries, the factory supervisor salary or the maintenance worker wages, those cannot be traced to the specific product. They are incurred for all the products that are manufactured during the period. Since they cannot be cost effectively traced to the finished product, they are categorized as indirect labor. Next, let's look at other indirect costs. This is factory overhead costs that are not indirect materials or indirect labor. So anything that cannot be classified as indirect materials or indirect labor is other indirect costs. Examples are factory rent, factory utilities, factory insurance, factory equipment depreciation, etc. If you notice, there is a theme here. It's everything that's incurred in the factory. If it is not incurred in the factory or the plant, it is not a manufacturing cost. Finally, manufacturing costs are direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. When you add those three costs together, that is the total manufacturing cost of the product. Sometimes manufacturing costs are also called product cost. If you see the term product cost, that's synonymous with manufacturing cost. That's it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions.